Before we start the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers.
Jake stood on his porch, cradling a cup of coffee, the morning sun casting warm rays across his face. The air smelled fresh, earthy from the dew on the grass and sweet from the flowers blooming along his driveway. It was supposed to be a peaceful start to the day, but that peace shattered as soon as he heard it. A woman's voice, shrill and cutting, rising above the usual morning sounds of birds and distant traffic. "Jake! Jake!" Karen's voice sliced through the calm like a blade, her words filled with indignation. Jake closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. He had tried, over the course of the last few months, to avoid any confrontation. He had always been the type to keep his head down and stay out of the mess that people like Karen seemed to stir up. But Karen wasn't the type to let things be, and today, like every other day, she had come to make some noise. He set the coffee down on the small table by the door and walked toward the front gate, hoping it wasn't going to be another one of her nonsense complaints. It was always something with her. His lawn wasn't cut short enough, the mailbox was in the wrong place, the trees in his yard were blocking the neighborhood's view of the sunrise. Sure enough, there she was, standing. In his yard, again, hands on her hips, staring at him with that condescending look she wore so well. "Jake, this is the third time I've come over here about this," Karen said, her voice shaking with feigned outrage. "You cannot just leave your driveway looking like this. Do you even care about the neighborhood?" Jake blinked, taking a deep breath. His driveway was perfectly fine. No one else had ever complained. It was the same driveway he'd had for the past 5 years. "I've been over this with you before, Karen," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "There's nothing wrong with my driveway. It's just nothing," Karen interrupted, raising a hand as though to swat away any further explanation. "You're blocking the view for everyone. You think just because you're out here in your little house you can do whatever you want? This is a community, Jake." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. Community. The very term felt twisted coming from her lips. Karen was the type of person who believed the community existed for her benefit alone, to be shaped and molded by her whims. The same woman who'd called in complaints about a neighbor's fence being too high, who'd dragged a local store owner to court over an unsightly sign, who thought rules and property lines were suggestions only when they suited her. Jake kept his tone level. "You've crossed my property line again, Karen. I'd appreciate it if you didn't come onto my land without permission." "Oh, so now we're going to play the my property card, huh?" Karen's expression twisted into a mix of mockery and righteous fury. "You're not the only one who has a stake in this neighborhood. I'm just trying to make it nice for everyone." "Nice for everyone? You're just making noise, Karen." Jake felt the familiar knot of frustration tightening in his chest. He'd tried to be civil. He had even tried to explain things reasonably, hoping to avoid conflict. But Karen wasn't a person who listened. She just bulldozed her way through, convinced she was always right. He could feel it now, like a knot in his stomach. That helpless, irritated energy that came from trying to reason with a brick wall. She huffed dramatically, then crossed her arms, as though preparing for some final word to be the end of it. "Well, if you don't start listening to people, Jake, I'm going to have to report you again." She jabbed her finger in his direction. "The HOA is already on my side. You just wait." Jake's jaw clenched. The HOA. He'd heard about her incessant complaints to them, spending her days filing complaints against neighbors for petty issues like tree branches hanging over the sidewalk or weeds growing a bit too tall. The HOA had never once backed up any of her claims, but that didn't stop Karen from trying. And now here she was, threatening him with more of the same. He tried to keep his voice even. "Karen, you don't have a case. This is my property, and I'm not doing anything wrong." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jake saw that familiar look of superiority flash across her face. "You'll see, Jake. You will. You can't hide behind your little house forever." With that, she turned, walking away, but not before giving him one last venomous glance over her shoulder. "I'll be talking to the HOA, Jake. This isn't over." Jake stood there for a long moment, the words still echoing in his ears. This isn't over. She was right about one thing. It wasn't over. It was never over with Karen. She would keep coming back, poking, prodding, pushing until she got her way or until someone broke. He wasn't sure which she was aiming for, but he knew one thing. He was done trying to reason with her. Karen was relentless. She didn't stop until she got what she wanted, no matter the cost. And at this point, Jake realized, his patience had worn too thin. He had tried being the good neighbor. He had tried to work things out, to be civil. But now, standing there, watching her disappear down the street with that smug look on her face, Jake felt the anger begin to rise in his chest. What did he have left to lose? A bitter laugh escaped him. Maybe it was time to let her know just how much he could make things difficult. Jake walked back inside his house, his thoughts racing. There had to be a way to handle this without losing his cool, without stooping to her level. But what if there was a way to turn the tables? Quietly, cleverly, so she never saw it coming? It was time to start thinking a little more strategically. Karen had made it clear that she didn't care about boundaries, but Jake wasn't going to let her cross his ever again, not without consequences. He sat down at his kitchen table, staring out the window, the gears in his mind beginning to turn. There was more than one way to make someone back off. And for Karen, it might just take a little bit of color to show her who was really in control. Jake sat at his kitchen table, his fingers tapping restlessly on the surface as the hum of his refrigerator filled the otherwise quiet house. He had spent the past few hours going over the events in his mind, replaying Karen's threats, her mocking tone, and the way she had dismissed him as if his concerns were nothing more than a nuisance. His irritation simmered, but something else was growing in him too, an idea. The kind of idea that, once it took root, wouldn't let go. He couldn't just call the police again. He couldn't rely on the HOA. They were useless, letting Karen run wild with her petty grievances. Jake knew what he had to do. The problem was that he wasn't sure how far he was willing to go. At first, the idea felt ridiculous, something born out of pure frustration. But the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the only thing that would finally make Karen understand the consequences of her actions. It had to be clever. He wasn't about to get into a shouting match or throw a tantrum like she did. No, this was going to be something calculated, something that would send a message loud and clear without him having to say a word. Something that would make her wish she'd never set foot on his property. Jake leaned forward, pulling out his laptop. He spent the next few hours researching. He scoured forums, watched DIY videos, and ordered materials online. His mind clicked into gear, his irritation sharpening into something more focused. He was going to build a series of color powder mines, simple, effective, and non-lethal. A burst of color, something harmless but humiliating, exactly what Karen deserved. More Jake thought about it, the more his plan came together. The idea was almost too perfect. Karen was the type of person who thought the world revolved around her, the kind of person who couldn't stand to be outdone or humiliated. The mines would be hidden along the edges of his property, triggering a cloud of color every time she stepped on one. There was no danger, no permanent damage, just a bright, attention-grabbing mess that would make Karen the laughingstock of the neighborhood. Jake smiled to himself as he clicked buy on the last of the supplies. He knew it would work. He didn't need anything too complicated, just a few basic materials, motion sensors, springs, some harmless color powder, and a bit of creativity. The hardest part would be setting them up without her noticing. But that, too, was part of the fun. The next day, Jake woke up early, the excitement of his plan lighting a fire under him. As he brewed his coffee, he thought about Karen, her self-righteous attitude, the way she marched around like she owned everything. He imagined her face when the first mine went off, and a small, wicked grin crept onto his face. He could already see it. Karen, frozen in surprise, staring down at the bright powder now covering her pristine outfit. The thought brought him a sense of satisfaction he hadn't felt in weeks. The day passed slowly as he worked, his hands busy assembling the devices. He tested each one, making sure they would pop just enough to send a cloud of color without doing any harm. His backyard was quiet, and the only sound was the rustle of leaves in the wind and the occasional click of the motion sensors. Each time, the little devices triggered, sending a small puff of powder into the air. Jake felt a rush of exhilaration. It was perfect, simple, harmless, but impossible to ignore. By late afternoon, Jake had placed the last of the mines along the front edge of his property. He stepped back, surveying his work. It looked harmless enough. To the casual observer, there was nothing out of the ordinary. The mines were small and unobtrusive, hidden just beneath the grass, and they would blend into the landscape. Karen wouldn't suspect a thing. As the sun began to set, Jake walked back inside and sat down at his kitchen table. He ran his hands through his hair, feeling a mixture of excitement and tension building in his chest. He had been planning this for days, and now the hard part was over. All that was left was to wait for Karen to take the bait. The next morning, Jake was up early again, peering out the window, his heart pounding in his chest as he waited. The neighborhood was still, the sun just beginning to climb in the sky. He watched as the first cars passed by, the occasional jogger passing by, but no sign of Karen yet. He didn't have to wait long. At around 9 a.m., he saw her, the unmistakable silhouette of Karen marching down the sidewalk toward his house. Her hair was done up in its usual tight bun, her expression a mix of arrogance and annoyance. She was, of course, headed straight for his yard, probably planning on inspecting it again for some trivial violation. Jake's pulse quickened. He was ready. As Karen stepped onto his lawn, her heels sinking slightly into the grass, Jake's fingers hovered over the blinds. The first mine was triggered, a small pop, followed by a burst of vibrant pink powder that exploded into the air. Jake barely suppressed a laugh as he saw Karen freeze in place, her mouth hanging open in shock. For a moment, she just stood there, blinking, as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. But then, before she could react, she stepped forward and triggered another mine. This time, it was a cloud of electric blue powder that erupted, covering her shoes and the hem of her pants. Karen's eyes went wide, her hands flailing, as she looked down at the mess now splattered across her pristine outfit. She let out a shriek, high-pitched and frantic, as the next mine went off, this time showering her with a brilliant yellow cloud. The sound of her voice, so familiar in its anger, was drowned out by the sound of more pops and bursts of color. Jake could barely contain himself. He had to cover his mouth to stop from laughing out loud. The sight of Karen, usually so composed and self-righteous, was utterly absurd. She was covered in a rainbow of bright powder, her once perfect outfit now a walking spectacle. Jake's heart raced with a strange combination of relief and exhilaration. This was it. This was what she deserved. Karen's face turned a deep shade of red as she looked around, her hands shaking with fury. She tried to stomp off, but each step triggered more explosions of color, making her look like a human canvas painted by the worst kind of artist. She yelled something incomprehensible, but it didn't matter. Jake was no longer concerned with her anger. It was working. For a brief moment, Jake wondered if he'd gone too far. But then he saw the neighbors peeking out from behind their windows, some of them laughing, some filming the spectacle. And in that moment, Jake knew it wasn't too far at all. Karen had crossed a line long ago, and now she was getting a taste of her own medicine. The chaos unfolded like a slow-motion train wreck, each new cloud of color making it more impossible for Karen to save face. She sputtered, her voice rising in shrill protest as she staggered back and forth across Jake's yard, the once pristine white of her clothes now marred with streaks of pink, blue, and yellow. She tried to wipe her arms, her face, but the more she flailed, the worse it became. Her heels sank into the soft grass, triggering even more bursts of color. It was beautiful in its absurdity, almost like an abstract painting that no one would ever take seriously. Jake stood by his window, arms folded, watching the spectacle unfold with a twisted sense of satisfaction. Every shriek, every curse Karen spat out, felt like a small victory. He hadn't been sure at first, hadn't known if this would actually work. But seeing her humiliated, seeing her so completely out of control, brought a sense of justice he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a real smile. As she finally turned to leave, her steps jerky and frantic, she looked up at the windows of the surrounding houses. Several neighbors were standing at their windows, some filming with their phones, others watching in stunned silence. Jake could see the realization hit her. She wasn't just the victim of some rogue prank.
She was the punchline of the neighborhood's favorite joke. She stormed off the yard, muttering insults under her breath, but it wasn't over yet. Jake knew it wouldn't be. Karen was never one to let an insult slide, and this was far more
than just an inconvenience to her. This was humiliation of the highest order. She'd be back. And when she returned, she wouldn't just be angry. She'd be vengeful. Jake had expected the initial outrage. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly Karen would escalate things. Less than an hour later, his phone rang. It was Karen, her voice dripping with venom. "Jake, you have no idea what you've just done. You think this is funny? You think you can humiliate me in front of everyone and get away with it? Well, I'm not going to stand for it. I'm calling the police, and I'm taking you to court." Jake leaned back in his chair, unfazed by the threats. "What's the charge, Karen? Assault with color powder?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line before she responded, her voice tight with fury. "You think I'm joking? You'll see what happens when I'm done. This isn't just going to go away. Not this time." Jake hung up, staring at the phone for a moment, almost tempted to laugh. He wasn't worried about her threats. He had made sure everything was harmless. The powder was non-toxic, and the sensors were discreet. There was nothing illegal about what he'd done, nothing that could be traced back to him in a way that would get him into serious trouble. But Karen? She was a different story. That night, Jake's phone lit up again. This time it was a text from his neighbor, Tim. "Man, you really did it this time. She's flipping out. The HOA's already getting involved and people are sharing her meltdown online. It's going viral. You might want to be careful." Jake stared at the text, a small, dark grin tugging at his lips. He wasn't surprised by Karen's response, but he hadn't expected the fallout to spread so quickly. The video of her tantrum was already making its rounds on social media, shared by neighbors and passers-by who'd caught the spectacle on camera. The video was being viewed thousands of times, with people commenting, making memes and roasting Karen in the comments. It was the kind of chaos Jake could only have dreamed of when he set his plan in motion. The sense of power that came from watching his enemy spiral into a whirlwind of public embarrassment was intoxicating. But there was more to this than just the immediate satisfaction of seeing Karen squirm. Jake realized that he had a choice to make. He could let the situation fizzle out, let the internet do its thing, and let Karen stew in her humiliation. Or he could push things further. He wasn't a fool. Karen wouldn't let this slide without some kind of retaliation. She wasn't just going to let this go quietly, and Jake knew she'd be back, this time with a vengeance. The next day, Karen's threats became a reality. A sheriff's deputy showed up at Jake's door. The officer was polite but firm, explaining that Karen had filed a formal complaint. Apparently, she had even gone so far as to allege that Jake had set up dangerous traps on his property. Of course, none of it was true. But that didn't stop Karen from doing everything in her power to twist the narrative. Jake invited the deputy in, offering him coffee while he listened to the charges, which were as absurd as he had expected. The officer didn't seem convinced, but he had to follow protocol. After taking down Jake's statement and confirming the harmless nature of the color powder, he left without further incident. But Jake knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to give up. She would escalate just as she always did. And now, with the video of her public meltdown circulating, it was only a matter of time before she launched a full-blown campaign against him. Jake didn't need to look up her name on social media to know she was already rallying her supporters, playing the victim to anyone who would listen. Jake sat back in his chair after the deputy left, feeling the pressure building. Karen's next move was inevitable. She had made her threats. She would call in favors, twist facts, and manipulate anyone she could to get her way. But Jake wasn't going to let that happen. He had one advantage now, one big advantage that could keep her from winning. She had already shown her hand, her weakness, her arrogance, and her sense of entitlement. And Jake? He was going to use that. The next phase of the game had begun, and this time, he wasn't just going to be reacting to her attacks. No, he was going to push her right to the edge, until she was the one trapped in her own web. He had been pushed this far, and he was done being the one on the defensive. It was time to take things up a notch. Jake leaned against the kitchen counter, his mind working overtime as he watched the sun sink low over the horizon. He'd expected Karen to lash out, but the speed with which she'd rallied her support was something he hadn't anticipated. Her complaints had spread like wildfire, reaching the HOA, the local news, and even a few concerned neighbors who had been quick to label him a troublemaker. They were calling it an act of cruelty and a public assault. The more Jake read, the clearer it became. Karen was positioning herself as the victim, but she'd made one fatal mistake. She had underestimated him. He had to act fast. If he let her frame the narrative, if he allowed her to turn the situation into a battle of words and legal threats, he'd lose. Jake wasn't just defending his pride now, he was defending his freedom. And he'd be damned if he let Karen win by manipulating everyone around her. Jake had one more card to play. A final move that would not only turn the tables but expose Karen for who she truly was. It wasn't just about embarrassing her anymore. It was about putting an end to the cycle of manipulation she'd spun for years. If he could make her own supporters turn on her, he might finally break her. He'd been doing his homework. Karen, it turned out, had a few skeletons in her closet. Some of them were more than just personal mistakes. They were legal missteps, small lies and manipulations that, if aired publicly, could easily tear her credibility apart. And that was exactly what Jake planned to do. Over the next few days, he planted a few subtle seeds in the right places. He made a couple of phone calls to the media outlets that had picked up on the story. He fed them just enough to keep the story alive, but this time, he added a twist. A leak about Karen's past. It was nothing too scandalous, nothing that would ruin her life, just enough to plant doubt. Jake didn't need to bring down her world. He just needed to make her so uncomfortable that she'd make a mistake. People like Karen couldn't resist the urge to control everything, and Jake knew her ego would lead her right to the edge. It didn't take long for the story to catch fire again, but this time, it wasn't the bright colors of the powder that everyone was talking about. It was the whispers of Karen's past, her former manipulations, her attempts to drive out neighbors who didn't fit her perfect image. It was a slow burn, but by the time she caught wind of it, the damage had already been done. Jake watched, from the sidelines, as Karen's public demeanor began to crack. The smug, self-assured air she'd carried with her for so long was beginning to falter. She lashed out in interviews, accusing the media of distorting the facts. But as she became more defensive, the more the cracks in her perfect image widened, and the more desperate she became, the harder it was for her to maintain her facade. The final straw came when she was caught in a lie during a live interview. She was trying to portray herself as a helpless victim, sobbing dramatically, accusing Jake of being a danger to the neighborhood, but a simple question about her own past triggered something in her that she wasn't ready for. The interviewer, doing his job, asked about an incident from several years ago, one where Karen had been involved in a legal dispute over a similar prank on a neighbor. It wasn't pretty, and Karen knew she couldn't deflect this time. The video of her squirming, her eyes darting nervously as she tried to cover her tracks, went viral in minutes. Jake watched the interview from his couch, his heart pounding in his chest. He could practically hear the gasps of disbelief from the viewers, the collective realization that Karen wasn't the innocent party she had claimed to be. The more she tried to cover up, the worse it got. The comments section of the video filled with shock, followed by scorn. Neighbors who had once supported her began to turn against her, sharing their own stories of her manipulations, the small acts of cruelty she'd hidden behind her well-crafted persona. By the time Karen tried to apologize publicly, it was too late. The damage was irreversible. The public was no longer on her side. The memes, the jokes, and the hashtags spread like wildfire, leaving her reputation in tatters. People were no longer laughing with her. They were laughing at her. Jake sat back in his chair, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over him. He hadn't just won. He'd exposed Karen for who she really was. The world now saw her as a bully, a liar, and a manipulator. And even if she managed to salvage some semblance of a life, she would never again have the power she once did. In the end, it wasn't the color powder that had done it. It was Karen's own arrogance and need for control that had brought her down. She'd made the mistake of thinking she was untouchable, that her money and influence would protect her. But she'd underestimated the one thing that had always been her weakness, her ego. Jake took a deep breath, letting the tension drain from his shoulders. The battle was over, and he had come out victorious. As he looked out the window at the peaceful neighborhood that had once felt like a battleground, he realized that the hardest part was finally behind him. The victory was sweet, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that Karen could never walk through those streets with the same arrogance again. As for Jake, he didn't need the last word. He had already won. But just for the fun of it, he posted one final video, a short, sarcastic clip of him tossing a handful of color powder into the air, with the caption, "Sometimes the best revenge is just a little splash of color." It wasn't about rubbing it in. It was about the satisfaction of knowing that for once, the right person had gotten what they deserved. Karen, meanwhile, was left scrambling, her life unraveling in front of her eyes. She had tried to control everything, but in the end, it was her own need for dominance that had undone her. And as Jake watched her downfall unfold, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. Sometimes the best revenge wasn't something violent or aggressive. It was simply watching the world see the truth for what it really was, and Jake had made sure that everyone knew it.